Okay, we'll get started as we're just a few minutes after the hour. My name is Justin Reish, and I am the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society, and I thank you for joining me today from wherever you are. Today, we are kicking off a new series of interviews titled Action This Day. This series will focus on the legacy of Sir Winston Churchill and his times in today's world. I'm very pleased that our inaugural guest is Ambassador Robert C. O'Brien. Ambassador O'Brien is the co-founder and chairman of the American Global Strategies, LLC. He was the 28th United States National Security Advisor from 2019 to 2021 and served as President Trump's principal advisor on all aspects of American foreign policy and national security affairs. During O'Brien's time as National Security Advisor, the United States orchestrated the historic Abraham Accords in the Middle East, brokered economic normalization between Serbia and Kosovo, achieved significant defense spending increases among our NATO allies, which has certainly come in handy recently, and increased cooperation with America's allies across the Indo-Pacific. Ambassador O'Brien, I really appreciate your time, and thanks for joining me.
Well, Justin, it's an honor to be with you, and especially being a member of the society. It's a real pleasure for me to spend some time with you and the other members. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So very quickly before we begin, I want to remind our guests of two things. First, this interview is being recorded. And second, the ambassador would love to answer your questions. So please use the Q&A function or the chat function to submit them, and we'll try to answer as many as we can later in this conversation. So to begin, I would love to have your perspective, Ambassador, on the key takeaways from the war in Ukraine as of today, which, as you know, started just over a month ago.
Well, the first thought is a personal thought. I spent time in Ukraine in 2014 as an observer for the United States of the parliamentary elections that were taking place at the time. I spent about 10 days in Ukraine, had a wonderful experience. So the people there are just terrific people. They love their country, they love their democracy. And as all this has been happening, I think of an event in Lviv during the election. There was a mom and she had her little 5-year-old daughter with her. And I was interviewing, folks as they came in and out of the polls, and I said, "Oh, did you not have childcare? You brought your daughter?" And she said, "No, my husband's at home. He's going to come vote soon. But I wanted my daughter to see me casting my ballot. I wanted her to see what a democracy was like at even this young age." And I think of that now during this horrific circumstance. I wonder if her husband's fighting and she and her daughter are refugees and internally displaced in Lviv, or if they're over the border in Poland or Romania. And my heart just breaks for the people of Ukraine. And I know that folks on the line agree with me on that. So that's just a personal note. I mean, this is a terrible situation that we're watching. We haven't seen an invasion of conquest in Europe since 1938. We've had some regional situations. The most prominent are, of course, Iraq and Kuwait and Argentina and the Falklands. But you have to go back to the early 1950s when China annexed Tibet to see a major power, a superpower engaged in that sort of conduct. And we haven't had it in Europe since Hitler got going. And the parallels are so striking with Crimea and the Sudetenland, and then the attempt to, not after being appeased and the very light sanctions that were put on Putin after Crimea, him making the determination that he could take the rest of Ukraine without opposition to the West. And so there are eerie parallels. Obviously, the person who's watching this most closely in the world is Xi Jinping, because he and his Communist Party of cohorts in the Politburo and the Central Committee in Beijing are wondering if this is an opening for them to take Taiwan. And so they're watching our response. They're watching the people of Ukraine respond and wondering if the Taiwanese people will show the same elan and daring and boldness and determination. But they're also watching to see how the West and how the free world responds to this. And if Putin will get away with it with only half measure sanctions, as we to some extent have in place now, or will Russia be decoupled from the international banking system and decoupled from the trading regimen that served the world so well, and so Beijing is watching.
And if I may ask, one of the reasons we invited you to be the inaugural guest is of course your very recent past as National Security Advisor And it's really important, as you just referred to, the parallels between 1938, 1939, especially, in those first few weeks in February, with, attempted diplomatic, conclusions, which of course didn't work. One thing I'd love to have your assessment on, if you're willing to speak to it, is how do you think the American leadership, President Biden's administration, has responded thus far?
So that's a great question. I wrote about this. I wrote an article back in 2014 before I was in government during the Obama years after the invasion of Crimea, in a magazine called The National Interest, and the title was "What Would Winston Churchill Do?" and talked about some of these issues, long before I was National Security Advisor. And taking a look at what the current administration is doing, and look, there are some smart folks in the current administration. I think Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and Jake Sullivan, my successor, and Lloyd Austin over at the Pentagon, they're all smart. They're all relatively moderate and fall within kind of a bipartisan consensus on foreign policy on most issues, Iran probably being excluded. And so they've done some good things. I mean, one they've rallied the West, and I think that's been an accomplishment. Now, what we're probably doing, that we would have done differently, and I don't like to criticize
Sure,
Jake and Tony, because they're in the middle of a crisis right now. And one thing I found is that I was much smarter before I was National Security Advisor about international affairs, and I'm much smarter after I've been National Security Advisor. When you're in the thick of it, it's a difficult thing. But I mean, I think one thing that we're doing that we don't need to do is we're telling the Russians, we're giving them too much information on what we will do and what we won't do. One of the things that we tried to do in the Trump administration was leave things ambiguous when it came to military action. So when we remove the risk from the calculation that the Russian planners are taking, and we tell them we're not going to give the Ukrainians MiGs, we're not going to give them S-400s, we're not going to introduce U.S. troops. And by the way, I'm not in favor of introducing U.S. troops. In fact, the Ukrainians don't want them. They're doing perfectly well fighting on their own. They need the tools necessary to fight the Russians, but they've proven themselves to be incredibly capable. But we need to stop telling the Russians what we're not going to do, and let them have some risk as their planners try and calculate their next moves. And when you take the risk away, you make their job easier. So that's something I wouldn't do. The other thing that and by the way, I think President Biden started to reinsert some of that risk with his gaffes. Everyone's reporting these are gaffes. I think the president, to some extent, was speaking from his heart. The White House walked back his statements, whether it was U.S. troops in Ukraine, or how we would respond to a chemical weapons attack, or that Putin needs to leave office. They did the same thing when he said a few months ago that the U.S. would defend Taiwan if China invaded. I think that's President Biden being President Biden. And so I see that there's something on the screen saying there's no volume.
No, Ambassador Brian, we can. I believe that's an individual's. Yeah. But no, hearing you just fine. Thank you.
Understood. Thank you. So I think what President Biden was probably trying to do was create some strategic ambiguity and complicate the life of the Russian leadership with the statements he was making, and that may have been useful. The last point I'll make is that we sanctioned the Russians very, very hard in the Trump administration. Those sanctions went beyond economics. They were stopping the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which we felt was something that was very important for the safety of Ukraine, but also for the independence, the energy independence of Europe, is not to be in a situation where the Russians could hold them hostage. When it came to the supply of oil and gas, we kicked the Russian. We ended our participation in the Open Skies Treaty because the Russians were cheating on that. We got out of the INF Treaty, and we also put very strict conditions down for renewing New START. So we took some tough lines with the Russians. We sanctioned a lot of their oligarchs. I welcome the sanctions on the Russian central bank and on the SWIFT, removing Russian banks from the SWIFT system that the current administration has put in place. The problem is those sanctions don't apply to oil and gas sales. Mm-hmm. And that's the only thing that Russia sells. I mean, Like, when's the last time anyone on this call has ever gone to Amazon and said, "Hey, I want to get that new thing from Russia"? Uh,
It's a
Never.
very
That
valid
never
point.
happened, right? The only thing they sell is oil and gas and some minerals and some agricultural products. And so when you remove those sales and exempt them from the sanctions, and the price per barrel of oil goes up every day, Putin is in a perverse way making more money, and Russia's making more money every day the invasion continues and oil prices go up, then he's losing on sanctions. And so we've got to end the half measures on sanctions and make sure we get to full sanctions that cover oil and gas sales, and really make the Russians understand that there's a price to pay for this malign conduct that they've engaged in.
I appreciated your comment about giving them the tools. If you remember, of course, Winston Churchill's plea to the American people and to the world, but really aimed to the American people: give us the tools, and we'll finish the job. When President Zelensky replied to President Biden's, genuine offer of support, well, I don't need a ride. I need weapons. That sense of individual determination and decisiveness of messaging to the world, we're not going anywhere, and is so, I'm sure, was so impactful. So I appreciate your comment on that. So if I can ask Ambassador O'Brien, it seems like really where we are now with the war in Ukraine is that Russia, specifically Putin, maybe didn't have the best intel, or maybe was misled by his advisors in terms of its armed forces and their ability to overrun Ukraine. As a previous one of the closest advisors to a head of state, possibly most definitely the most powerful head of state, when you were, if you were in that situation, and of course, you and I were talking before the call started, there's difference between democratic governments and authoritarian governments. But from your previous experience of advising presidents, do you think he got bad advice? Do you think he was just being told what he wanted to hear?
Look, I'm sure there's some of that because Putin's a former KGB officer. He's acutely aware of the danger of coups and regime change from within. That's what the KGB specializes in. So he's been very careful over the past 20 years to purge anyone in the Russian government, the oligarch, the group of oligarchs that are close, the news media, anyone that could be an opponent to him has most likely been purged out of the Russian system. So I think he's probably safe. And then that creates what happens is, it creates an echo chamber where people only tell Putin what he wants to hear. Telling him otherwise might end up with a one-way ticket to the east somewhere. So that I think folks are very aware of the danger of speaking truth to power in a situation like you've got in Russia. But I also think that look, I think he overestimated the improvements in his military. They've spent a lot of money, or at least purportedly spent a lot of money on the military. Now I'm wondering how much of that money that was supposedly going to the Russian military actually went into these yachts that are being seized around the world and went into offshore bank accounts as opposed to spending on the Russian military. But I think he was probably misled by his own folks as to the capabilities of the Russian forces. We certainly had a higher estimation of their ability to conduct joint arms operations than they've shown in this Ukraine crisis. I think that's been one of the big takeaways from the event. So, but I think excuse me, the third thing we have to focus on is that with dictators and authoritarians, we often ignore what they say. We don't take them seriously, and we say that's crazy talk. We take the position that no one rational would invade a neighboring country. No rational Russian would believe that the Ukrainians really want to be part of a new Russian empire and give up their ties to the West and their burgeoning economy and their Apple stores and that sort of thing, and become part of a revanchist Russia. But Putin believes this, and he's been talking about this for 20 years, saying that the greatest geopolitical tragedy in Soviet / Russian history was the breakup of the Soviet Union. And he's been talking about reassembling of it. And we've ignored that, just like we've ignored what the Chinese have said about their plans for the South China Sea, for parts of India, for certainly Tibet, for Hong Kong, for Taiwan, because in our view, as folks who live in a democracy or democracies and free countries, it just sounds like a throwback to an earlier era that doesn't exist any longer. And so we made a mistake of not listening to Putin. So I think Putin's probably been surprised that maybe he started believing his own propaganda about how the Ukrainians would welcome the Russians. I mean, this idea that Zelensky, who's a Jewish leader of Ukraine, is a Nazi. I mean, it's just absurd. But you wonder how much, how often he's repeated these sorts of claims. Maybe he started to believe them himself.
So if I can, let's move to your time as National Security Advisor. Of course, there was, before you came in, there was the phone call between President Trump, President Zelensky. But let's talk about when you became National Security Advisor. You're briefing the president every day. You're talking about all types of geopolitical and domestic risks. Was there ever a discussion between you two, and of course your very large team, that projected any potential invasion of Ukraine by Russia? Or as you said, you guys would always reassure yourself there must be a rational actor going, in Russia. Any conversations that you had during that time that you are able to share?
Well, so it's my policy, and those of you that watched on TV, unless it's been publicly disclosed by the president, I don't discuss my personal conversations with the president. But what I can tell you is what our policy was, and some of the policies that we undertook specifically with respect to Ukraine. I mean, obviously we were concerned about Russia because it had been not only spending a lot of money, it's fully modernized its nuclear triad. It spent a lot of money on its submarine force. It's been building a new fleet of frigates that have hypersonic missiles, or at least missiles that can be. There's debate over how you classify hypersonic missiles, but these frigates with significant missile capability, whether it's hypersonic or ballistic, it probably doesn't matter because they're very. At least the intelligence has been that they've been very effective, and then he pared down the Russian military pretty dramatically to a smaller group, around 200,000 soldiers, that we really thought was kind of the equivalent of the U.S. Marine Corps. And so we were concerned about this activity. And then when you combine that with his willingness to use force abroad, whether it was in Syria or Libya, or the threats to the Baltic states, to certainly to Ukraine, the threats against Poland, he certainly caused our radar to be up. And when you combine his activities on the defense side and rebuilding the Russian military, his external activities, and I mean, they're far afield using Wagner Group. I mean, they were as far afield as the Sahel, in Niger and Burkina and Mali, and putting Wagner Group folks down in Mozambique, purportedly to fight ISIS. So there was a real concern, and then you saw that married up with what's called an unlimited partnership by Xi and Putin with China. It was a big concern of ours. Specifically with Ukraine, there were four things that we thought would be useful. Number one, we really increased NATO spending, and we got a lot of pushback. I remember the NATO summit. I spent a lot of time with Jens Stoltenberg, who's a terrific leader of NATO, just a wonderful guy. And Stoltenberg and I worked very hard. The president kind of took the bad guy approach on it, leading up to the summit, and what was a little tough on our NATO allies, a little rough in the negotiations. But the result of that was, for the first time in NATO history, we had real burden sharing. We had a commitment from non-US NATO allies to increase defense spending by $400 billion over 10 years. And looking what's happening now in Ukraine, that's pretty amazing. The other part of the burden sharing is we also got NATO allies to send significant troops to Afghanistan and to Iraq, so that the US wasn't carrying the load alone. By the time we left office, in Afghanistan, we had 5,000 NATO troops, only 2,500 US troops. So we had 2-to-1 NATO troops to US troops. So there was burden sharing. Number two, again, as I mentioned before, we thought stopping the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was critically important because it preserved the pipelines that were going through Ukraine and gave Ukraine some leverage with the Russians, but it also would have kept Europe from becoming totally, or at least Central Europe, Germany and Eastern Europe, from becoming totally dependent on the Russians for their oil and gas. Three, we got the Javelin missiles, which really were responsible for blunting the Russian invasion. We got those missiles delivered to Ukraine. There was a lot of slow rolling of that by various people at the Pentagon, folks that didn't want to provoke Russia. It had been stopped by the Obama administration before we got there. So that was something we worked very hard on getting those supplies there. And so then there were other issues. Obviously with arms control and otherwise that were part of a broader relationship with Russia. But as it goes to Ukraine, those were the things that we thought would be most effective in stopping them. And I guess the last point will be there was always a level of unpredictability with President Trump. We were very quiet about what we would do militarily in response to various contingencies. When I went on Meet the Press or Face the Nation, or we didn't answer hypotheticals about what we would do if Russia invaded because we wanted to keep them guessing as to what we might do. And I think there's a benefit to that sort of unpredictability. And so fortunately, while I was in office, and actually the entire time President Trump was in office, the US for the first time in many, many administrations didn't start a new war or didn't have to militarily intervene with another country. And Vladimir Putin didn't invade another country.
And I think it's so important that you bring up the ability for personal diplomacy within allies. Your discussions with Jens Stoltenberg. When you're in that position of needing to be completely informed, so thus then you can inform the president. How do you find common ground with somebody such as Jens? And again, not asking you to reveal any personal conversations or details like that, but with somebody who's the leader of a multi-country, incredibly diverse organization that to boot is armed with weapons and is dedicated to preserving peace. How do you shuffle that from like you said, the rather not harsh but assertive, I would say, pronouncements by President Trump to your counterpart to get those things done?
So look, it is diplomacy is sometimes saying the nastiest things in the nicest possible way. Someone defined it as that, and my personality is to do my best to get along with the folks I'm working with and negotiating with. I mean, with Jens, it was very easy. As a consummate professional and terrific guy who was head of government in his country. So it was pretty easy to work with him, and we had the same goals and ultimately the same goals and values in dealing with a Western leader like him. I got along very well, and we had a great working relationship with President Macron, with Prime Minister Johnson, with Prime Minister Modi, certainly with Prime Minister Abe, and later I think Prime Minister Suga, and so it's certainly Scott Morrison, Prime Minister Morrison in Australia, and Prime Minister Ardern were close allies and confidants. But I think it's important in diplomacy is you need to develop a personal relationship. There's got to be a lot of faith and trust by being candid, but delivering those messages in as personable and as cordial manner as possible. And then finding what are the building blocks that we all agree on that we can work on to get to an agreement that's good for all the countries involved in the negotiation. So obviously it's a lot easier when you're negotiating with your NATO allies and diplomats and heads of state and heads of government that share your values and are democracies than it is negotiating with the what I'll call the bad guys, and I've had plenty of experience negotiating with them as well, especially when I was doing hostage work. But you do your best as a diplomat to ameliorate some of the rough edges of international politics and see if you can get to agreements that are good for both countries.
Yeah, and that's why you're there, as you said. And if I can just make a quick aside to those so many questions, this conversation is about the ambassador's experience with Ukraine and other sort of international conflicts. So we will keep the questions to that experience. I do see some great questions already submitted, and we'll get to those shortly. I do want to ask you, Ambassador, you have a very open affinity for Winston Churchill, and not only are you a member of the society, but of course, for those who are watching, you see not the official biography and the portrait of Sir Winston behind him. Let's talk about how his example of leadership in adversity, of never give in, not just from how you feel about that translates today with President Zelensky, and please feel free if you'd like to expand on that. But during your time in that leadership role of the National Security Council, how were you inspired by him?
Well, look, this is probably not fashionable any longer, and I know we've got a lot of historians and social scientists who are watching and on the chat today. But I still think there's a role for great women and great men in history, and I think they make a difference in history. And I understand that demography is and geography and ideology and social movements, and market forces all play a role in history. There's no question about it. But there's been a tendency, recently it's become out of fashion to talk about how a Winston Churchill or an Abraham Lincoln or a George Washington in the American context, how a Gandhi or even a Nelson Mandela in South Africa, have made such a massive difference in the lives of not just their country, but the entire world. And I think something that we're seeing with President Zelensky is we're watching, and I don't know him well. I think I've met him once, and but he's not a perfect guy. But we're watching a leader transform into a legend in a way that we haven't seen before in many years, maybe since Reagan and Thatcher and John Paul II, achieved the victory in the Cold War. And we're watching how his leadership, how his decision not to take the ride out of Kiev early on when we offered to send helicopters to evacuate him and his cabinet to Lviv or to Warsaw, but instead he decided to stay and fight. We're watching how leadership actually makes a difference in the affairs of men and women and in the affairs of nations. And I think it's a good lesson especially for younger people who are watching. I've taken a couple of weeks off work the past few weeks to give some speeches and spend some time on TV and to do some fundraising for Ukraine, because I think it's the least I could do given what the Ukrainians are doing, fighting in the trenches and fighting in the frozen fields and watching their fighting in the apartments, everything that they're doing to defend their country. So I've tried to do a little to help. And in a couple of speeches, I said, we're seeing something, he's becoming a legend, kind of like a Hector and Troy or Davy Crockett. And I was briefing Republican members of Congress, and I said that, and I thought, it didn't end well for Hector or for Davy Crockett at the Alamo. So I've got to come up with a better analogy. And so I said, maybe he's going to be the De Gaulle of his people. And then, somebody reminded me that De Gaulle actually did take the lift to
yes, he did.
not blaming President de Gaulle, because General de Gaulle is a great leader and a hero, but he actually took the lift and got out of France. He came back and my position is he went to Free France for most of the time, so he didn't really leave. But Zelensky, we got to find the right analogy. I'm not sure. He's certainly Churchillian in a way now, but I think that analogy can be overdone as well, because he's not leading the British Empire. But he's showing certainly Churchillian characteristics and traits in how he's responding to his people, and he's mobilizing what Churchill did. He's using the English language and mobilizing public opinion in a way to defend his country in a way that we haven't seen anyone do perhaps since Churchill. So there are a lot of parallels. I'm not sure I found the exact right historical parallel for Zelensky yet, but what we're watching is that we're watching a historical figure being made in our lifetimes, as opposed to reading about it, 50, 100, 1,000 years later. And so it's leadership matters. And look, I tried to, when I was in office, to finally get around to answering your question. You try and do the right thing, and you try and do the right thing for your country and for your for the president and for the world in that situation. And certainly Churchill was someone who inspired me on a daily basis. I kept a Mark Currents, who many of you know is a Churchill book dealer in California, gave me a small little pamphlet that I had put on the wall at the in my office, the National Security Officer Advisor's office, right down the hallway from the Oval, and I hung it next to my door, and I would see it as I walked out of the door every time I went to see the president. And so I try to think of Churchill and how he would conduct himself in similar circumstances. And I certainly wasn't prime minister and wasn't the head of government like he was, but maybe it was more akin to his days in the Admiralty.
Well, as you know, his example and his of his leadership is people come to it in all different ways and in all different avenues. You don't need to be a leader of a country to feel inspired by his example. And nobody, Ambassador, nobody holds it against you that you're not a not a head of state. I do want to, there's a great question. I'll start getting into these questions because some are really great. And by the way, shout out to Mark Curitz, who's a good friend, I think, of both of ours. So the person that you referred to who gave you that pamphlet. So this question comes from Lou House, who's a member of ours, a longtime member of ours in Colorado. And this goes to what I know is a personal interest of yours, Navy, of the Navy and building up the fleet, which you guys actually did as part of your time at the White House. So Lou says the neglect of funding for the U.S. military in the past results in the Navy and Air Force operating with equipment that much of it is 40 years old. Is the current budget increase sufficient to address current combined threats from China, Russia, and Iran?
It's a great question. The answer is no. We took a real hit in the 8 years. Look, this has been something that's been a bipartisan problem since the end of the Cold War. So it's not just a Republican or Democrat issue. We've underfunded defense because we decided to take a holiday from history, and we decided that that history was over, that democracy had won, and so we let the Chinese steal all of our IP. We let our military dwindle, and Churchill talked about this after the Anschluss with Austria, and talking about how victory had been squandered by the Allies, but particularly by the UK at the time, the British Empire. We let we had a very similar situation. We took the peace dividend, and then the 8 years under Obama, 6 of which we were operating under defense sequestration. The military was more than decimated. People like to say, well, the military was decimated. Decimation would have been fine. That's only a 10% cut. We had a dramatic problem with the military. The Navy and Air Force were hard hit. I was writing about this from as early as 2007, 2008, that we have to rebuild the Navy. We're a maritime country. We're blessed by the great Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, which keep us safe. But we haven't faced a threat like the naval buildup that China's engaged in, since Kaiser Wilhelm was building up the Kriegsmarine and prior to World War I, and we were seeing, but the Chinese are doing it much better, much faster, and much bigger than the Kaiser ever thought about. So we have some terrific challenges. I've got daughters who are in the armed forces. One who's a pilot, and fortunately she's going to be flying a newer model plane, but a lot of the kids in our Air Force are flying planes that not just that their dad would have flown, but their grandfather would have flown. When you think of the B-52 and some of the older legacy, some of the A-10s.
Incredible. I didn't know B-52 was still in service.
It's still in service. It's going to go probably for about another 30 years. We've got new engines on them and new avionics, and it's a pretty amazing aircraft.
It is, of course.
Give those engineers from the 1950s a hell of a lot of credit, because they built a great platform. I wish we could do the same at a relatively decent price. We have trouble doing the same today. But look, if we don't rebuild our Navy and our Air Force, we're going to put ourselves in a position where our adversaries perceive that we're weak, which may or may not be true at the time. But even a perception of weakness in international affairs is provocative, and it could lead to a war, because as Admiral Davidson talked about, it is this Davidson window that the Chinese think there's a 5 or 10 year window when they'll have sufficient superiority in the Western Pacific to take Taiwan, and the U.S. won't be able to deter them or stop them. And Putin obviously made that calculation with Ukraine. And so, I go back to the position that peace through strength works. And the reason that you didn't have, other than Grenada, which I view as more of a hostage rescue of the medical students than a full-fledged invasion, the reason under 8 years of Ronald Reagan, you didn't have a war is because our adversaries understood that the United States was strong and was massively rebuilding its military. The same is true under the 4 years of President Trump. And so, my view is that peace through strength works. And if we rebuild our naval service and our military and our Air Force as we can and as we should as a nation as wealthy as ours, that actually ensures peace. It doesn't ensure war. It's a little counterintuitive, but it ensures peace and
Determined.
100%. And so that's why I've always been in favor of making sure that we have a fully funded modern defense force, because I think it keeps us safe.
It reminds me of the Falklands War, when the Argentinian corrupt junta thought, oh well, Britain's in decline. They've had the winter of discontent a few years ago. They don't have a strong, and they just took a pot shot at it and see how that worked out for them. And so it's certainly there are times in history where
I think it was preceded by the UK pulling out an icebreaker and a patrol boat in the South Atlantic, and they felt that was the final. That was kind of an east of Suez moment for the United Kingdom. Now, again, the United Kingdom turned out to be far stronger than the Argentines expected, so it was a misperception. But that was the point that I was saying. Even a perception or a misperception of weakness is provocative. It turned out at the end of the day that the UK was strong enough, but just barely, to assemble the task force and send it down to the South Atlantic and win a glorious victory for Margaret Thatcher and for the people of the United Kingdom. But it was a close run thing that could have been deterred and should have never happened if a couple of frigates had been stationed in the South Atlantic during that time, not necessarily even in the Falklands, but just been on regular patrols. That might have been enough to deter the junta from taking that action.
And to your point, the perception, and I mean, that icebreaker, I think they wanted to save, a couple million pounds. So they tried to not to make light of a situation where people died, of course. But so a few more wonderful questions, and for those listening, we have about 15 more minutes. So Ambassador O'Brien, I'd love to get into these. So great question from Smarty Sigurdsson. Ambassador O'Brien, and allow me to say, before I ask this question, many questions about NATO, and I think it's a very timely topic. We'd love your perspective on the current state of the organization. So from Smarty, Ambassador O'Brien, Finland is not a member of NATO like Ukraine. Well, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, or excuse me, Finland is not a member of NATO, comma, as is Ukraine. What do you think will happen if Russia will invade Finland? And that's a very provocative question.
Well, so it didn't work out for the Russians very well the last time they invaded Finland. In 1939, right. I think there were 1 million Russians that were lost in that initial invasion. So look, I wouldn't want to invade Finland. I think they're pretty tough. And you watch those biathletes at the Olympics and think about, thousands of them up on skis in the north in Lapland. You wouldn't want to be on the other side of that. So I don't think the Russians should invade Finland. I think it would end very poorly for them. But I think the Finns woke up after that speech. And again, a lot of people said it was a crazy speech, but I think we have to listen to what he said when Putin announced that he wanted Ukraine, he wanted the Baltics, and that Finland was part of the Russian family. I think the Finns woke up and said, hey, wait a minute, how did we get pulled into this? And so I think that one of the things that may result from the invasion of Ukraine, and I think it would be very good for the West and very good for Europe and very good for North America, is if Finland and Sweden both became members of NATO. Finland and Sweden both have extraordinarily capable militaries and naval services, especially the Swedes. They've got good air forces. The Finns are not going to buy the F-35. They've got incredible intelligence communities in both countries. So they would strengthen NATO. And one of the things that Putin tried to do with this invasion of Ukraine was weaken NATO. And if he ended up with a stronger NATO as a result of it, because Finland and Sweden joined NATO, that would be terrific for the West. And I think it'd be good for Sweden and Finland, be good for Europe. And again, I'm a huge fan of NATO. I think it's one of the most effective and important alliances that we've that the world has ever seen. I think you'd have to go back to Rome and its Latin allies to find an alliance where the values and interests of the people were so aligned, and folks were willing to fight together as we did in Afghanistan, and we've done in many other places around the world, as you see with the NATO alliance. And again, it goes deeper than that. It's older. I mean, when we think of the Anglosphere and the alliance with France and the UK going back to World War I, obviously we brought Germany into the fold and many other countries, but it's an incredibly effective alliance. It'll help us not just against Russia, but in any coming conflict with China. And so to the extent we can strengthen NATO, and bringing Finland and Sweden into NATO would strengthen the alliance, but it would also protect those countries, because I don't think, irrespective of his rhetoric, I don't think that Vladimir Putin would ever dare invade a NATO country, given the Article 5 commitments that we have, and also seeing how poorly his military has performed in Ukraine.
And as a descendant of Finnish immigrants, I share your point of view of tough people who made great strides in a very unwelcoming country. So I should say environment. So a really good question here. This is so speaking of Russia and its military.
They're Vikings that speak Hungarian, you know.
That's right. That's right. So a question from Randy: will Putin, in your opinion, in your perspective, will Putin remodel his army to be less dependent on one-year conscripts, or is he so alarmed the West that Russia has lost any opportunity to invade a neighbor for decades? I think we know the answer to the latter part, but you really talked about initially, Russia spent a lot of money trying to remodel its military. Seemed like it didn't go very well.
Yeah, look, I think we thought that they'd already done that. I mean, that was probably a failure of Western intelligence, and it may have been a failure of Russian internal intelligence as well. I mean, we thought that they had remodeled the army, that it had become much more professional, that they were trying to have an NCO corps that was cadre of sergeants, and they could really make the army operate. It's very hard to do that, but very hard to have NCOs when you've only got people doing 1 or 2 year conscriptions. And so I think that's what they try to do. Whether they can do it going forward, I think it's gonna be tougher. And look, no one wants to enlist in the Russian army. I mean, when you watch what's happened, I mean, you've got no food, you've got no ammo, the logistics strain is terrible. I mean, I think it's gonna be hard to recruit for a professional army. So I think they're gonna have to rely on conscripts, because no one's gonna join voluntarily. I don't care how good the TV commercials are for it. They actually have a pretty good recruiting TV commercial. It's on YouTube, but the difference between the commercial and what's actually happening in Ukraine is vast. So I think they have to try and fix things, but whether they'll be able to do it soon enough to be a real threat to NATO is unclear. I mean, we were very concerned about, we had a striker brigade in Lithuania. At least we did at one time. I think it's still there. About 5,000 soldiers with lightly armored wheeled armored personnel carriers. And we were worried that, with all the talk of the new Armada Russian tank and the superiority of Russian artillery, we thought those poor guys could be nothing more than a tripwire. Now you're looking at that striker brigade, and putting aside the nuclear issue, in a conventional situation, that striker brigade with U.S. air cover stacked with 22s and 35s on top, and 16s and 15s, and then A-10s and Apaches and UAVs. I mean, that striker brigade would probably be in Moscow in a week. Given what we've
it'd go all the way to St. Petersburg.
Yeah, given what we've seen. Yeah, given what we've seen in Ukraine. So I feel pretty good about that. And then the Russians obviously have to rebuild and retool. How quickly they'll be able to do it, remains to be seen. They're going to have to end the corruption, because I think, as you see some of these yachts, I mean, they're the size of frigates. I mean, they could probably, for what they've spent on these yachts, they could have probably had 10 or 15 more warships in their fleet.
And I was telling you, I was in London. We took a graduate course, GW students, George Washington University students in London, did a bunch of Churchill things, met with the Royal United Services Institute, had this incredible debrief from their Eurasian expert. He said 6 flag officers have been killed in 4 weeks. And he's like, to put that in perspective, the United States, there's been 2 since Vietnam included. And that just blew my mind.
No,
Incredible.
no, it's much more like a World War II attrition situation for general officers. And I think what happened is the logistics got so screwed up, and I think you had Russian generals going out to the front to try and unscrew it and fix it, and they became then vulnerable to Ukrainian snipers, and so again, it really harkens back almost to a World War II situation where you had that kind of attrition of general officers, and something we haven't seen before. And again, look, when I served in the Army, I was an Army reservist. I was a JAG officer, so I was not a tip of the spear soldier. But even with the limited training we had, watching what's happened has been certainly surprising on the Russian side. I mean, it was one of just the lack of coordination between the infantry and their tanks. I mean, you've got tanks that don't have infantry screens or don't have armored personnel carriers that would, I mean, if that had, if one of our tanks was ambushed, you'd have Marines, going contact right out the back of an armored APC, very quickly and engaging the enemy. And but these tanks are being sent out, 1 or 2 tanks at a time with no infantry screen. It's really a surprising. The tactics are bad, the logistics are bad, and I think these Russian generals have probably put themselves at risk trying to go fix the situation. But then because of their cell phone use and Ukraine's intelligence services and Ukrainian snipers and artillery, they put themselves at a tremendous risk. And I think it's now up to 8 general officers have been killed.
Goodness. And those new tanks are now being dragged across farmyards by tractors, which is just so humiliating. I mean, just the morale, it just seems brutal to be an infantryman. So let me get to a few more great questions before we have to end, Ambassador. This is from Khadija. Are we witnessing the emergence of a new international order? This is in terms of, core states, power structure war in Ukraine, Russia versus Ukraine, in Russia versus the West, China versus the US and Asia. And if we are witnessing a new international order, what could be the cascading effect to other areas of the globe, Africa, Central Asia, Middle East?
Yeah, so that's a terrific question, and one of the things that we thought we did away with, and look, I'm not I don't like some of these terms like the international rules-based international order and things like that, because I think they've been people don't know what they mean, and B, they haven't always delivered for the American people or for working people in many Western countries. But we had done away with, or at least we thought we'd done away with at the end of World War II, this idea that nations could could legitimately increase their size and legitimately obtain territory through conquest. I mean, that used to be something through international law for hundreds of years, thousands of years, that if you were bigger than your neighbor and you conquered them, that was a legitimate form of acquiring territory for your country. I think we thought we'd put that behind with the UN Charter and with the end of World War II, where Hitler was the last head of government to try and do that. Hitler and Stalin together. Let's not forget the Russians were just as involved at the beginning of World War II of trying to slice up Eastern Europe and expand the Russian Empire and Poland and the Baltics and otherwise. But we thought that was done. But if this Ukraine invasion stands and we can't repel the Russians, you're going to have an incentive, and we can't make the penalties for such conduct so high that basically you lose your chance to have economic intercourse with the rest of the world. I mean, trade and being part of the WTO and being able to sell your goods, it's a privilege. It's not a right. And so we don't have to participate in trade or finance or any of those activities with a malign actor like Russia. And so if we really cut the Russians off, and there's a true penalty for trying to conquer their neighbor. And again, the whole idea here is Putin thought he was going to get 44 million new Russian Slavs to build his empire. He's got a terrible demographic problem in Russia. No one wants to be part of what he's got to offer. he doesn't even have a revolutionary ideology like communism to try and sell. It's just simply Russian nationalism. And he, apparently he believed his own propaganda that he thought that the Ukrainians would welcome, the Rodina, Mother Russia, coming back and absorbing them. They obviously have no interest in it. They've shown that pretty dramatically. But if we don't stop it, if we don't create a suitable disincentive, there's no reason that you're not going to have Iran doing the same thing in Iraq. And you see them with Kataib Hezbollah and with the Houthis in Yemen and with Hezbollah and Lebanon and Hamas and the Gaza Strip. You're going to see the Chinese doing the same thing, not just in Taiwan, but in the South China Sea, in the Senkaku Islands, and with Japan. You're going to see they've already engaged in combat in a treacherous, despicable fashion with the Indians in the line of actual control in the Himalayas. So if this sort of behavior, isn't punished and deterred, it's going to increase, and then the world order that we've all lived in is going to change dramatically, and the world's going to be more dangerous to travel, more dangerous to do commerce, and more dangerous for smaller countries that live next to big countries, because there'll be no disincentive for them not to be taken over and conquered.
So if I can finish with two questions, the first being a very technical question, but I find it interesting because I'd love to know the answer to this from Stephen Shore. Does the National Security Advisor read the president's daily intelligence briefings? Are they privy to that?
So the National Security Advisor is actually in charge of that whole process.
Oh, wow.
We're working with the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI. And the DNI has a staff that assembles that brief every morning. It's a little bit of a misnomer. It really goes out to about 200 top leaders, maybe a little less, in the U.S. government, in the military, and cabinet officials and that sort of thing, including the president. The National Security Advisor sees that daily, and then, but that's not the brief that's. And the president, of course, gets a copy of it every day. The Vice President, Secretary of State, Defense Secretary, and others, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Commerce. But then what is often referred to as the presidential daily brief usually takes place, and I think this is true with the Biden administration as well, is that you have what's called an Oval Intelligence Brief. And that's where the CIA briefer, or the DNI briefer, is usually a CIA official, senior official. The Director of National Intelligence, Director of the CIA, the Vice President, and the National Security Advisor sit around with the president around a horseshoe around the Resolute desk, and that briefing is delivered. And there may be others who sit on the couch behind, sometimes the Chief of Staff or the White House counsel, or others will participate in that briefing as needed. There's Woodward reported on how the briefing went when we talked about COVID and issued the warning, and the president's talked about it. I had Matt Pottinger attend, my deputy at the time, who was an expert on China and was getting a lot of the intel on what was happening there with the COVID outbreak, joined that meeting. So at the discretion of the National Security Advisor or the president, others can be invited to that Oval Intelligence Brief. So that takes place a couple times a week. I think in the Bush administration, it took place every morning. So he really did get an Oval Intelligence Brief overlapped with the presidential daily brief, but usually with the PDB is referred to as the briefing that goes out in paper form or electronic form to senior leaders every morning. And then there's the Oval Intelligence Brief, which is where the president's briefer gives them a briefing. And that usually happens 2 to 3 times a week. And from what I've seen from the public schedules, that's how the Biden administration is doing it as well. Now, that's not the only time the president gets briefed, because he's constantly having interactions, multiple times a day with the National Security Advisor. My assumption is Jake Sullivan, like I was in the Oval Office or in the dining room behind the Oval Office 4 or 5 times a day on various issues as they arise. The Secretary of State probably has a lunch. I know Mike Pompeo did once a month with the president, and then had other interactions. And it really depends on the president's style. The CIA director was Gina Haspel, in my case, was often coming over to give special briefings to the president. So the presidents, I think this is true of all presidents, are voracious consumers of intelligence and information, and usually aren't going to wait only until they have their Oval Intelligence Brief. But that's kind of a chance to get a level set with everybody involved and have more time for a deep dive, as opposed to shorter interactions on specific issues.
If I can end with this great question from Marie. She says, "Hi, Ambassador O'Brien. Given that the trajectory to positions in the U.S. government is varied, what would you advise graduate students, those who are interested in leadership positions in the federal government, to do to best prepare themselves for the challenges of the future, how to position themselves well to emulate the statesmanship of Winston Churchill?"
So that's another very good question, and certainly my path was to becoming national security advisor was a bit varied. I'd been in and out of various administrations, and I picked a lot of losing presidential campaigns. So if you ever see me with a presidential campaign, short it, because the poor candidate is probably the high water mark for the candidate if I joined their campaign. But I spent most of my career as a lawyer, but I spent over a decade as an Army Reserve officer. I think the military is a great way to get experience. It's not the only way to get experience, and it certainly doesn't, being a company or even a field grade officer doesn't qualify you in and of itself to be the national security advisor. But I think it's part of the equation. I think as much education as you can get at an advanced degree, whether it's a master's or PhD in one of the political science or international relations, or a JD on the legal side, especially if you're going to focus on international law. And then there's just no substitute for experience. And so working on a House staff, House committee staff, especially HASC or Foreign Affairs or SASC in the Senate, or the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, SFRC, those are ways to get excellent experience. And then hopefully if you're on your party's in office and you can get a job, working as a staffer in the White House or even in any of the departments. And there are a lot of departments deal with national security that folks don't think about. The Commerce Department has a tremendous impact on national security. Treasury Department, the Agricultural Department of Agriculture there's a lot there. USTR, of course. So finding those positions either in the executive branch or on the Hill. But I'm a big fan of going in and out of the private sector, and there are a lot of great private sector law firms that have offices overseas that are engaged in international work. Certainly, there are a myriad of companies that are engaged in national defense, not just the traditional defense contractors, but also the technology companies. So I think there are a lot of ways to gain the experience you need to move up and ultimately obtain one of the higher level positions. But look, I think service. I think when you go into these positions, service for its own sake is important. I think, too often I see young people and kids, and I was probably guilty of this as well, working on building a resume and building a career as opposed to focusing on what they're doing at the time and succeeding and magnifying, as maybe use a little bit of a religious term, magnifying your calling. So whatever you're doing, whether it's a junior staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, be the best staffer you can be and make a difference. Pick one issue, whether it's getting the right radar on a frigate or whatever it is that's before the committee that you can have an impact on. Do the very best you can in that situation, and I promise you what happens. It doesn't always appear to be the case. People up the food chain see the younger folks and the more junior folks who are successful, and they look to use them, and they look to put them on projects, and they look to promote them because that hard work and the determination and the never quit attitude of Winston Churchill shines through whatever you're doing, even if you think it's it may not be advising the president on the geopolitics of a crisis. It may be just figuring out how to get aid to a country and do it efficiently and effectively and help that country. Your superiors are going to see it, and you're going to be rewarded for it and get promoted. So focus on the calling that you have and doing a great job, and the promotions will follow, as opposed to focusing on building a career or resume is my advice on that front.
Thank you, Ambassador. And as you know, as we all know, Winston Churchill's career was incredibly varied. Peaks and valleys is a great way to put it. In learning from both success and failure will serve everyone well. So, Ambassador, thank you for your time. Thank you for your service, of course, in your variety of ways that you serve our country, and most notably your time in the Army Reserves. I did not know that, so thank you.
Well, thanks, Justin. It's again privilege to be with you as a fellow Churchillian, and God bless you, and God bless everybody on the call and the video today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.